I've bungee jumped from the third tallest bridge in the United States about 3 times in the middle of the night, gone down to nearly 50 meters in a deep dive with a trimix, high altitude, low opening, skydive, abandoned on a desert island in the Indian Ocean for 2 weeks. Risk is one of those concepts that are in the same category as freedom or happiness. Commuting is probably the most dangerous thing you will do this year. You don't get that gut feeling when you get in a car. Anxiety is a byproduct of uncertainty. The very design behind these information platforms is attention grabbing. You have to generate uncertainty and anxiety. We need to treat information the same way we treat food. We need to have a healthy diet. The ones who survive are the ones who have a scout mentality, that accept the fact that might be a little wrong.
Looking into the future, would you say in the future we'll have more risk or less risk? And how do we prepare for the future?
Well,
share with me a few of the most risky things you've ever done in your life.
Okay, so that's an interesting question, because I've done a few things that are a bit on the edge. I suppose amongst those, I've bungee jumped from the third tallest bridge in the United States about 3 times in the middle of the night.
Okay.
That's about 790 feet bungee jump. I've gone down to nearly 50 meters in a deep dive with a trimix.
What's a trimix?
That's a particular combination of gases that you need if you want to do scuba diving beyond the sports level, depth.
So how deep did you go?
50 meters.
50 meters.
Yeah, that's substantially behind at that point. This case is beyond the limits for sports diving.
Okay.
And then I did high altitude, low opening skydive on several occasions, and one occasion I actually did it with a snowboard.
Okay, yeah.
That was kind of a lot of fun. But very early in my life, when I started a little bit of this journey of adventure, I remember I was pretty much abandoned on a desert island in the Indian Ocean for 2 weeks with only 2 days of survival rations.
Okay. How did that happen?
Oh, that was a voluntary thing. It was it was an experience that I signed up for together with a bunch of pretty adventurous folks. It was about 9 people. 2 French Foreign Legionnaires, 3 Special Forces Italian guys, and 2 Polish people, and myself. And again, we traveled all the way to India, then China, and then we obtained a special permit to enter the archipelago of Andaman and Nicobar, which at the time was a restricted area, so you couldn't travel as a tourist. So you had to have a special permit. And finally, after a few days of negotiating with the government, we got the permit, and then we had a number of locals, transport us to the spot, with boats.
Yeah.
And so forth. And
is that like a film documented, or how did you what you just did it for like to know you can do it? Like what? Yeah. What was it
there
like?
Was a record of it and everything.
Yeah.
It was it for some strange reason we did end up on some national radio interviewed when I came back, which was really unexpected. I didn't want to be on it, but bottom line, I wanted to know why in the world I would want to do something like that. This was you have to remember, this was in an era that preceded the the Think Pink movement, or the exploration of mountains with like free climbing and everything, where people started kind of dropping away out of the hard equipment and just doing more of climbing adventures and things like that for the pure pleasure of pushing one's limits. And survivalism was not something that was yet considered cool, like of the kind that you saw later in TV shows, right? So like that. Yeah. Back then, it was kind of frowned upon, and it was, to be, to be fair, it was very much military driven. It was only people from the special forces community that kind of pushed themselves through these tests. Yeah.
Were you in the military also before? Is that how you
I was, but I did that actually before the military. So I was barely 18.
So you're saying that the military wasn't the reason why you got into it in the first place?
No, on the contrary. In fact, the military, I joined the military at an era in Italy where, first of all, it was compulsory. It was a mandatory army, but, I was amongst the few that actually volunteered for a more challenging, I guess, military service. A very small number of people were given the opportunity to try to do an accelerated path to officers.
Okay. What did you have to do?
Well, in lieu of doing the traditional 6 weeks of boot camp, it's actually a 6 months screening and training program that started with approximately 7,000 applicants. And at the end of the 6 months, the number that was supposed to be left with this program was 168 out of 7,000. So it was a very, very tough, screening and training program that weeded out pretty much anybody they could.
All the weaker ones, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to put it that way. But it's just every excuse goes to cut you out, right? You faint because of exhaustion more than the others, because everybody at one point fainted for exhaustion because it make you sleep. You don't sleep, you don't eat, you run all the time. So, but some simply fainted one time too many and they kicked them out, or you just get sick, or you break a bone or something like that. And then of course there's this really somewhat abstract concept of what they call military attitude. In other words, can you put up with it?
Right.
The challenge. Can you, will you put up with that kind of abuse, and mental strain?
Why do you think you wanted to go through that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, already at that point, which is bizarre, I had a very clear reason for going through that. And that was that at that time, it was the only path to be able to join an extraordinarily elite group of anti-terrorist operators, and that was so small that literally required that you made it to in the top 1 percentile of this kind of training. And I simply put it in my head that that's what I needed to do and wanted to do. Now you have to understand. I grew up. I was a young man as a kid in an era known as the anni di piombo, also known as the lead years
Okay.
in southern Italy. And those were the years of Euro-terrorism, of Red Brigades, Roterme Fraction, Bader-Meinhof, Black September.
Okay.
It was the height of the Euro-terrorism.
I see.
And basically every day on TV, you would see something related to, terrorism, a shootout between law enforcement and terrorists, a kidnapping, a hijacking. This was also the era of, mid 80s, early 80s was the era of frequent hijackings, right?
Oh, yeah. And that was your childhood. You saw a lot of
at an age where you're very impressionable. I was growing up seeing this, and I started developing very early on this kind of immature fascination though between the good and the bad guys. And obviously I thought I definitely want to be one of the good guys, and so that was a path, right? This to try to join an organization that was the elite of the fighting force in this fight. Of course, I ended up not joining that organization. Served in the military in another capacity.
You out of the 7,000 people went to 170 to prepare you for a particular role that you ended up not taking?
Correct.
Why?
See, this also lays the foundation of why ultimately I ended up leaving Italy and migrating to the United States not long after. Believe it or not, I got lucky, maybe simply because of motivation, but out of those 7,000, I ended up second in graduatory. So there was only one person ahead of me. That tells you how obsessed I was, not necessarily because it's all about, commitment.
Yeah.
It's not about being particularly stronger than others and everything. Everybody who's been in the military will tell you that
it's a mental strength.
It's a mental
strength. Yeah.
It's all in your mind, You could never anticipate who makes it at the top of such strenuous or arduous, psychophysical challenges from their, physique or, you can't. It's not the one that looks the strongest. It's not the one it's the biggest,
the least expect, the one that you least expect.
What happened is that I arrived second, and interestingly enough, the guy that arrived first, who ultimately had one choice before mine to, and could have elected to take that spot, he had no interest in this particular unit because he actually came from a long tradition of a military family that, so he really wanted to do the traditional career, if you will, all the way to, if you will, the top echelon of the armed forces. So the special forces were not necessarily of his interest. So I thought, here I am, I got it, right?
Yeah.
Lo and behold, I hadn't paid attention to another individual in the course that was only, if you will, notable for the fact that we wondered how in the world he had made it through, because he wasn't particularly committed or better than others, but somehow he survived every cut and everything. And I hadn't paid attention to the fact that his last name was the same last name of the current Minister of Defense.
It's like a relative. Yeah, like
so
something.
Correct. So that spot was basically
reserved.
And I ended up serving in a wonderful, different unit that was extraordinarily interesting for other reasons, because it actually one of the oldest military unit in the Italian army, founded the same year that the French Foreign Legion was founded, in fact. And it was the remnant of the horse-ridden artillery. So it's a mixture of cavalry, artillery, with extraordinarily deep and old traditions of etiquette, but also of pride on the battlefield, that type of thing. And I became a section commander, of howitzers. But again, this a lifetime ago. So I served just the minimum that I was obligated to serve in that capacity, because that was not really what I wanted to do with my life. But so after 2 years, I left.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. So risk has been a thread throughout most of your experiences. Yes. You've looked at the life experience through the prism or the lens of like assessing risk in a way. Or at what point did that awareness come to you?
Well, look, first of all, let me put it this way. I felt so blessed for having been one of those people that never once had to ponder what they wanted to do with their lives. Yeah. I was on a mission basically from age 13. Yeah. And it's but what that was, of course, evolved with time, right? Yeah. Because when you're a kid, you basically have this movie-like interpretation of what life is going to be about, or what certain roles mean, certain professions. Yeah. And of course, they, after you invest some time in them and you actually start diving deeper into them, you pretty much stumble in the reality of life, which tends to be pretty different than what you imagined it would be. But nonetheless, that passion, if you will, that evolved over the years was simply one of, first of all, challenging my boundaries within the context of really security and safety and protecting others. I always had a bit of a protector, if you will,
syndrome.
Yes, a protector syndrome. Yes, that emerged from a bizarre set of circumstances in my upbringing. And so I'll tell you something that might surprise you, but actually it came as a reaction to the fact that I grew up in an extraordinarily privileged and pampered environment. A family that was amazing in terms of emotional and practical support in a very idyllic environment in the Mediterranean, on an island with very long summers and a beautiful climate and beautiful beaches. But in that context, I was the ultimate mama's boy. Was incredible. I was so attached to my mother, like every good Italian man, it never stopped that, by the way. I was always a good mama's boy. But it occurred to me at one point that I was literally an outsider within my own community, because I was afraid of almost everything, to leave my family's side, right? Because I grew up so pampered, and everything outside of the norm, or that I had to do on my own, was terrifying. Yeah. But in that transition occurred, probably, as I said, when I was like 12, 13, 14, and I started trying to push myself. I felt this need to, and with little things like, straying away from home a little further, spending the night out in the garden. Yeah. And then starting to push more and more those boundaries. And turns out that I became addicted to it. Overcoming one's fear can be very empowering. Now, it can be something as immediate and if you will, more physical, so associated, for example, with something like jumping from a bridge, right? That is something very physical that you have to overcome, that fear of height, and taking that step. And there's a very obvious and strong physiological component to that, right? That adrenaline rush. Everybody has heard about this adrenaline rush, adrenaline junkies. And that is certainly how it started for me. I started really liking that adrenaline. That's why I started doing these things, jumping from planes or doing free climbing in the Dolomites. All of this already by the age of 17, deep diving, pushing, again, and, but as I grew older, I learned that can apply to things beyond just the immediate physical reward, if you will, or the adrenaline rush, but rather this idea is this is a very difficult thing to do. There's no immediate, reinforcement, if you will, from pushing your boundaries. And that would be the case of, joining again then the military, right? I mean, there's no immediate physiological return when you actually sign up and they lock the doors behind you, okay, when you first report. And without question, you're in a different world now. And all your pillars, the ground that you walk on, and your safe havens are gone. There's no running back home to mama. So that obviously before you actually see a reward in that, it may take months, if not years. But nonetheless, I'm sure I'm not the first person you talk to that will tell you. So what do you make, for example, of your experience in the military, right? Or even maybe in the Peace Corps, traveling the world under pretty, constraints or challenging circumstances. And almost inevitably, you will hear people say, well, at the moment, it was tough as hell. Okay? But boy, I would never give that up. That was the most forming and important experience of my life. And and so was that experience of survival that we started this conversation on. It was probably the most transformative episode of my life. Probably even more than the military, I would say, even if it was only 2-3 weeks.
Crazy, So since then, you've been putting more intention and action towards learning about like risk and understanding it, and now having a company around that. So so maybe starting from, what's your definition of risk? Like what is considered to be risky?
Well, look, that's first of all, this is risk is a fascinating concept, right? For one important reason. It is basically a universal concept that pervades openly or indirectly our daily decision making, our life, every day, every moment, whether we're aware of it or not. But it is also one of those concepts that we throw around very frequently with great comfort, and to some degree, some level of confidence too about what it is. But we do so with some misconceptions. But primarily because of the fact that it is such a common and really universal and ever-present concept.
Yeah.
We never really unpack it or question it.
Mm-hmm.
Risk is one of those concepts that are in the same category as freedom or happiness.
Or maybe even God. Like,
even God or belief or right. The faith.
Yeah, faith, yeah.
Right? That we just throw around on a daily basis. It's part of the background of our understanding. Mm-hmm. But we don't realize how little we really know about it until you start digging deeper. Mm-hmm. And you start asking real question about what does that mean? And you realize that there's an enormous amount of ambiguity around this concept of risk.
Makes sense.
So in a more formal definition of risk, if you will, it's pretty straightforward, and it's the likelihood of adverse events or negative events, things that might harm us.
Yep.
In this sense, this is the part that most of us realize how we struggle with such concept until you start really unpacking it. Mm-hmm. Is that it's a forecasting exercise.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's a prediction.
Yep.
If it's something that happened in the past, it's no longer a question of risk. It's a question of knowing a fact.
Yeah.
Or quantifying something. Did anybody get hurt? Did I get hurt? Did you, were you attacked or not? Mm-hmm. Did you lose money or not? Mm-hmm. It's a fact finding about the past. It doesn't mean that that's always, perfectly clear, sometimes facts are difficult to uncover, what that's not a conversation about risk.
Yeah.
Any conversation about risk subtends the fact that we're making a prediction. Yeah. And that ranges from the likelihood of us ending up in a car accident, or becoming the victim of a crime while traveling somewhere or visiting another part of town, or that we're going to lose our job next year, or that our portfolio will crash next week.
Yeah.
All of those things are predictions. And to dive a little deeper, there's two elements to this prediction, right? One element is the likelihood. In other words, how likely is it that this is going to happen? What probability do you assign it?
Yes.
And the other piece typically is the nature of the event, the impact, which in some cases is...
like severity, maybe, no?
So the severity, indeed. So the severity, if you want to call it that way. So it's... So it again, in some cases, it's declarative, right? What do I mean by that? It's like, am I going to die or not?
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious. Okay, well, what you're talking about is your death, right? Or am I going to get hurt? Or will I, will I lose money? Okay, so the question is, well, okay, at that point you could say, okay, what do you mean lose? How much, right? How much money are you going to lose if you try this? So now it becomes a little less declarative, right?
Yes.
And I can tell you that for most risk judgments and decision making, actually there's a considerable amount of ambiguity around the impact, because it's one thing to say, oh, things are bad. We do that all the time.
Yeah.
The direction of the country is very concerning. And so we say things that, well, but what exactly are you talking about?
Yep.
Right? What are we talking about? And also when it comes to even very basic decisions, like, is this location, for example, that I'm picking as a vacation spot risky? I mean, is this trip risky? And what does that mean, right? It could mean a lot of things.
That's right, yeah.
I mean, does it mean that you're going to get in trouble in transport, meaning that you're going to get stranded somewhere, because transportation is terrible. Or does it mean that somebody's going to harass you while you're there? Are you going to get imprisoned by, questionable government agents, right? Officials. So, the spectrum of things that could happen to you is enormous.
Yep.
But notice that most of the time, that's not what people do. People just say, "Oh, is it dangerous or is it risky to go there?" Without a lot of consideration of what phenomenon are you trying to anticipate.
It's like a crude approximation of the circumstances in the future. They just say it's a risky thing, and they don't really spend too much cognitive power in like breaking it down and understanding what part of it might be risky. And so you
That's right.
Yeah.
That's correct. We approximate a lot of this, and more importantly, we do this. Most humans do this naturally. Most of these risk calculations occur below the surface of our awareness. But here's the thing that I can tell you that is most striking. Whether you think you're doing it or not, and whether you're aware of it or not, you're always making a risk estimate.
Makes sense.
So let me give you an example. You wake up in the morning and decide to commute to work.
Yep.
And then take an appointment somewhere. Maybe, again, that involves driving or visiting an area that you haven't seen before. And participate in a business maybe during that moment, like saying, okay, yes, I want to be part of this effort. And then you drive back home and go to bed. And during that whole day, you may think that not once have you thought about, if you will, openly about trying to evaluate the risks of these actions, right? So you're saying, "Oh, I don't think about risk," right? Well, no. What actually is happening is that your brain in the background is conducting all these forecasts of what you're going to do during the day. How are you going to get to work? And in doing so, it's basically assuming that nothing exceptional is going to happen.
Correct.
Therefore, it doesn't require your attention. You're basically assuming that your commute will repeat itself, or the success of your past commutes will repeat themselves again. And therefore, you don't have to concern yourself. You can repeat your actions. You don't have to pay attention or take any significant action.
Right.
When you visit a place, you basically, in the background, your mind is going through certain patterns and signaling that you don't need to do anything special. You can go around, not even change your maybe emotional status, and so forth. If instead, and how do you know that that's happening? Because if I told you that instead, the location that you're going to visit may require a change of plans in terms of how you get to it, because there was a shooting and the police are surrounding the area and everything. That piece of information would suddenly draw your attention to the fact, and you would start making a calculation. I wonder if it's safe.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
You simply don't have that signal. So there's this ongoing prediction that is happening in our mind that determines whether there are signals suggesting that now extra attention is required by you.
And so that is doing the thing on the back of our mind. It's serving us. The approximation and like preserving your limited cognitive resources, that's by design in the way. It's constantly trying to like fit as much. Basically, it's trying to keep you alive in as many cases as possible, and so it's trying to consolidate, generalize, approximate things like that. In what situations this kind of like brain function is not serving us? Where can we be acting differently, or like how can we do better in certain situations?
So that's really the heart of the question, right?
Yeah.
And this is the area or the domain where I spent most of the time both studying and trying to coach people on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a particularly challenging one, because the question you're asking, if I may suggest, it can be rephrased also as such, which is, when should we trust our instincts and our so-called autopilot?
Yeah.
And when should we not? Right? This is what you're saying.
Yes, that's right, exactly.
I'm trusting my guts, right? Because basically my guts are telling me I'm fine.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm like, oh, wait a minute, this doesn't sound right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, the answer to that is it's a bit convoluted. And I'm going to try to break it down in a couple of, if you will, simple rules.
Mm-hmm.
The first is to acknowledge that our autopilot and our gut instincts are not always the best thing to follow.
Mm-hmm.
But they can often be.
Mm-hmm.
And when is that true and when is it not? Well, first of all, our autonomic system and our survival mechanisms, or what I also like to call our survival operating system, our survival OS, that we inherited through evolution, is extraordinarily sophisticated, and it's very much deeply rooted in our physiology and our psychology, and in ways that, frankly, in many ways, which we don't even control, right? Mm-hmm. We have this natural fight or flight or freeze reaction. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, we have that, that allows us to swim, to duck, to react very quickly. That triggers a certain hormones that accelerate our heart rate, our respiration, and allow us to react. That
makes sense.
Very, very powerful. Mm-hmm. So, but those are typically attuned to and built around what we call real-time immediate threats. Right. So those instincts really pertain to the world of, hey, can you detect a vehicle that is, suddenly stopping in front of you? Can you, jump out of the path of a crashing vehicle? Okay. So let us be clear. There is no statistical model that outperforms that, okay, or AI. So because the context is extraordinarily complex, and we have this magnificent set of senses, right? Eyesight, smell, hearing, that contribute to that particular OS system, which has helped us over millions of years evolved in a very challenging physical environment. However, and going back to the question, when do they actually provide a disservice? Mm-hmm. Well, typically, when it comes to making decisions that are not immediate, which is the majority of what we face, if you will, in our daily existence. We're no longer, in the bush, in the jungle. And we operate in a fairly mediated environment with a lot of safety and security constraints. We don't encounter tigers and predators, and the food that we typically access has already been selected for us.
Yeah,
that's a longer conversation there. Of course, not all foods that we eat are that good for us, but so the question is about decisions and risk perceptions and judgment of our future self. And when I speak of the future self, and is anything in the next hour or the next month or the next year. Okay. And that's where our gut instincts are pretty fallible. They unfortunately, they tend to provide us a disservice in that they use a certain heuristics to develop that are not very well suited for a long-term planning.
Yes.
One of which would be, for example, the fact that we rely on our past experience as the primary source of forecasting.
Yeah.
Okay. So, there is this particular phenomenon that is well documented. In fact, and it's probably the single most influential fallacy or bias when it comes to risk judgment. And it's technically known as the base rate neglect or base rate fallacy. Okay. And what that fancy term says, it says that we tend to favor personal experience or narratives any day over statistical information.
Makes sense. Yeah.
It's simply and it's specifically because of our operating system that lends so much weight and power to our past experience.
Yeah.
Because of our history and evolution. Okay. Because and let me put that in context. Okay. Let's make a real world example.
Yeah.
There's a very good reason in a literate environment to basically rely on your past experience because you have nothing else. But if you go down by the river 2-3 times to fetch water, and then on the 4th time there's an alligator that attacks you and you barely survive it. The next time you go, you should be very nervous.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So that episode should leave a very strong impression.
Yes.
This is how you survive.
That's
okay.
Right. That's right.
So you could have got hurt, or you got hurt. You don't want to do it again. Okay. So now that it makes perfect sense. However, as we evolved, and society starts accumulating data and information beyond our own personal experience, we learn much more about the patterns of these things, of these phenomena. And we might learn that particular incident that you experienced was extraordinarily rare because it was a runaway alligator that was lost, and there was really no alligator.
It was just a zoo nearby, and it
Correct.
happened, right? Yeah.
And so for you to be concerned and not fetch water there and maybe, go 5 more kilometers on foot to get water simply because of that episode would be a very poor choice. Okay. But more importantly is the absence of risk that is very particularly dangerous, not the belief that something is particularly risky. And where does that come in? Let me give you another example where, again, our instincts disserve us. And that would be the very familiar case for everybody of driving and ultimately, relaxing while driving.
Yeah.
And possibly texting and speaking on the phone. Okay, so what happens is that our brains are wired to tell us, you pay attention a lot the first time, right? When you start driving, you know how attentive you are, right?
Yeah.
Your senses are a little low,
Right.
You're very cautious. And then the more you do it, the more you relax, the more it happens on autopilot, right? The more you can start thinking about other stuff and you incur into that very, popular phenomenon of basically, mindless driving where you arrive at destination and you can't even recall how you got there, right? Well, so that is happening exactly because our brains are designed to leverage our past experience in that particular action or activity and derive a base rate.
Yeah.
How dangerous is it? When you start doing 100, 500 times, 1,000 times, you basically assume that is not dangerous at all. But that's really, really problematic.
Yeah.
Because actually commuting is probably the most dangerous thing you will do this year. And the difference between you surviving and not surviving or getting injured or not getting injured is literally the degree of attention that you put into that activity. But, again, unfortunately, you will start to dismiss it.
And on the contrary, sometimes trusting the data only, you are, what's the word? You're basically your muscle of intuition and intuitive guidance gets diminished, or you're not as well at making those decisions that require basically inputs that you're not aware of. There might be somewhere on the subconscious level, but there's still I feel like we atrophying the function of intuitive decision making, which will lead us to a catastrophe. Like where,
Your point, yeah.
You know what I mean?
So there's certainly truth to the fact that you could also do the opposite error, right? Or over relying on data, right? Or someone else making those decisions for you, right? Which we do constantly. We offload it or relinquish
more than ever. Yes.
We relinquished our self-preservation and a lot of these decisions to others. To some extent, I have to tell you that's a good thing. Simply because, once again, we're not suited to make a decision on, for example, whether it's better to drive at 30 miles per hour or 130. If it's left up to us, we wouldn't do that. And unfortunately, as a society, as a group, it's much better to relinquish those decisions because you can look at it from the big picture, and those tend to trickle down. So, on the other hand, you're correct that first of all, there is a big caveat when we say that. Data that I often say that data or statistical base rates are more informative and a better source of risk judgment and decision making than your instincts. The caveat is that you really have to have the right data.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is
and interpretation too.
Correct. The right data and interpretation, and it's not easy at all.
Yeah.
Often we don't have that, right? We don't, like, it's very difficult. And when I say the right data, again, base rates are, a statistical modeling, right, of a larger set of population that what you can do with your own personal experience or even with your clinical experience. It's just what we learned over the years. The medical profession made giant leaps forward when they went from clinical decision making to statistical modeling. However, the problem is that for that data to be so-called better than what you have from your personal experience or clinical experience, it would have to be very much fitting. In other words, the reference population of whatever that data represents, right?
Yeah.
It should be very relevant to what you're doing, not generic.
That's right. Exactly.
Right? But to have that, it's pretty darn complicated.
Totally. Yeah.
And often it's simply not available.
Possible. Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah. Let's give an example so that we go away from the abstract and go to the practical.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, you could compare one country to another in terms of violent crime risks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's pick even a more specific one, such as homicide. What's the likelihood that you're going to get murdered, right? Okay, well, so if you take a national statistic, a base rate like that of the United States, you're saying, and I can tell you that approximately right now the United States has a murder rate between 6 and 7 per 100,000. Okay, now if you compare that, I don't know, with let's pick maybe a challenging one. Let's pick a country like with some of the highest murder rates in the world, maybe Brazil. Okay, Brazil has a national murder rate probably approximately it's between 35 and 40 per 100,000. Okay,
in America is 6. You said
yes. Yeah, 6 is between 6 and 7. Okay, so
like 5 times more.
So on at this level, you would say, well, there's absolutely no question, I'm much safer in America than I am in Brazil. Okay, but that would be a mistake.
Right.
Because you have a very, very large and averaged population. It is not really relevant to your life.
Exactly.
Okay. So your life, what is relevant to your life and my life is really more the environment that we negotiate over the course of a year, right? Or, and so what environment do we negotiate? Maybe the city, like the city of Miami, right? Okay. So now, it turns out that, the city of Miami has a very different murder rate than the United States as a whole.
Of course.
And so Sao Paulo has a very different murder rate than the rest of Brazil.
Right.
And you may very well find yourself in plenty of cities in Brazil that are substantively safer than cities in the United States. So here is the case of, should I trust, the base rates and everything? But so base rates can also be very disinforming and illusory unless you understand, are they relevant to my circumstances, to my life? Now, but again, I encourage you to consider the fact that the alternative, using your experience, your guts, unfortunately, it's not very effective because you may have traveled 5 times to Brazil, and your instincts will tell you that you understand how dangerous it is. And it's an illusion. You don't understand it. Going 5 times for a few days to Brazil, or even living for the whole year, it doesn't give you a statistical insight.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. So projecting, so looking into the future, would you say in the future we'll have more risk or less risk? And how do we prepare for the future in that regard, would you say?
Are you speaking in terms of humanity?
As a risk, yeah, any kind of risk, like living life, being alive and navigating human experience, is that more risky? Will that be more risky in the future in your view than, let's say, 100,000 years ago or even now? And if so, how do we prepare for the future reality that we might be living in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, let me state that by having spent the past 30 years looking at risk and our capacity to forecast, I'll tell you right away, we're terrible at forecasting.
Right.
So I'm the first one to admit that I'm probably wrong, but here's...
So maybe answer first the question, in history over time, has risk been
declining astronomically?
That's right.
So basically, we as humans have been increasingly living in safer and safer environment, healthier, longer and safer lives. This has been particularly true in the last century and a half, 120 years, which have been literally an outlier in the trajectory of the human species. The last 120 years have had a greater impact on our survival and our longevity, which are two different things, but than basically the past million years. Believe it or not, the difference in survival rate and say mortality rates and longevity between primates and humans, it's pretty much 10-15% all the way to the early 1800s. And suddenly we actually doubled, if not more, our lifespan, and nearly wiped out our risk of death, at the earlier stages of our lives. Just in the early 1800s, basically 50% of people, let me put it this way, if you were born in the 1800s, you have a 50% chance of making it past 14.
Oh, yeah.
Right now, in high-income nations, it's between 97 and 99%.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's pretty impressive. So now, to answer your question, my forecast is that life will become increasingly safer. Okay? With bumps on the road. There's bumps on the road. There's always been. There's, for example, let me put it this way. For example, in the United States, if we look at our history, during the 1970s and then again in the 1990s, we experienced an incredible peak of violent crime, homicide rate. In fact, in the 90s, it was basically twice as bad as it is now. We had twice the number of of homicides. Now, same for motor vehicle accidents. We, we went from, you have to look in rates, because obviously the number of cars, the number of people that drive, and so forth changed. But I can tell you that we halved, if not more, our rates of motor vehicle deaths. Okay, but those had increased very rapidly over the previous 2 decades, and that was the end result of new technologies, right? And certain social phenomena such as urbanization, and so forth. But that's to say that it's not a perfectly downtrending line, but it is a smooth line when you extrapolate it all over decades, and it is a downtrending line with not only this caveat, if you will, all bumps in the road that could emerge from various things. They could emerge from new technologies. They could emerge from new
a virus. Exactly. Yeah.
And there is always this particular risk of, what, everybody probably that listens to your podcast and have been defined as black swans, right? By Nassim Taleb, and this idea of extreme tail rare events with high impact that basically guarantee the fact that you cannot bet 100% that the trend of mortality, morbidity, and everything of humanity goes in a certain way. But those are, again, these tail end phenomena that are very difficult to predict.
And then speaking of anxiety being on the rise, that's related to danger. Like we become usually anxious because we feel that we are more in danger than before. How does that is that a misfiring because our primal brain, the primal brain is not prepared for the modern world of like what we consider dangerous, and it's just we interpret danger in too many ways that we shouldn't really be, because it's not a physical danger that we're experiencing, but like more of a mental danger.
Yeah, you're onto something there. What here's probably another way to put it, which is, anxiety is a byproduct of uncertainty. Okay, so uncertainty is really the primary driver of our stress and anxiety. Okay, we are hardwired to abhor uncertainty. Which goes back to that principle of saying, do I understand the environment that I'm in, right? Self-preservation. You can see how this is an enormous evolutionary and survival advantage, because if we walked around, the bush with this really naive idea that everything is great, and then start eating foods that we never tried before, or entering areas of town, or listening to a sound that we don't recognize and just simply walk towards it, that would be a sure bet, to kill ourselves. Okay, so it's obvious that our default position is, if we don't understand something, or we feel that we cannot interpret something, we cannot frame it, and we don't understand which way something is going, that triggers a sense of discomfort. It can be measured. It's fascinating, and first of all, some of us have a natural higher tolerance of uncertainty than others. This is a psychological metric and a test that one can take. It's called, tolerance of uncertainty. And, but
you said there's a specific test?
Oh yeah.
What is it called?
It's a UT test, uncertainty tolerance. You can take which measures a little bit to what extent you are okay with a world that is not predictable. That things might.
It'd be interesting for me. Like I would suspect that I would rank somewhere on the higher end because I'm very comfortable with uncertainty personally.
You are, yeah, great,
very much so, yeah.
That typically. I mean, that can be good or bad, right?
Yeah.
From a self-preservation standpoint, but here's the point. Now, what generates this uncertainty in our modern world is increasingly the result of information. So it's not the result of experience or physical or responses from the senses.
Yes.
Okay. So in other words, it's not necessarily seeing something that it's difficult to interpret, smelling something that you don't recognize or experience, which is the way this mechanism, it was basically, I'm not saying it was designed to do, but that's how it emerged. But it's purely abstract now, right? And how does that emerge in our daily lives? And it emerges in the form of an increasingly high volume and speed of information. And we're talking about, our devices, right? That ultimately alert us or drive us to actually look at these devices, look at them constantly. To television, to radio, to the web, our devices, and so consider that the very design behind these information platforms, whether it's social media, whether it's the news media, whether it is our, email system. The very core design principle of these platforms and information sources is attention grabbing. Okay? And to grab attention, everyone in the media knows, everyone in social media knows, you have to generate uncertainty and anxiety.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So and what does that mean? You have to either create a sense of a sense of urgency. Right? How do you create a sense of urgency? With very salient information, very powerful images, rapidly moving images, loud noises. Semantic choices that tend to associate themselves with urgency, hazard, threat, immediate response requirement, just from the simple ping, right, to all the new message on your cell phone, right? That is a device to draw your attention. It's like a siren call, right? Ding, right? Now, those are designed to stimulate the same systems that we leveraged to scan the environment and determine what deserves our attention for our survival. Okay? Which takes precedence over everything else.
Right.
Because of our own design, we need to preserve ourselves. We need to pay attention to those things. It's the same concept why you cannot help yourself but turn your head when you drive by a scene of an accident. Okay? It's just, we're hardwired that way. Now, you can see how the frequency and volume of all these signals that were in the past associated with a lightning strike, a particularly cold breeze that may have forewarned, a dark cloud and a storm. The rising waters in the body of water next to your village, these signals are supposed to draw uncertainty and anxiety, right? So then you pay attention.
Yes.
Okay, well, or again, the sound of an animal, of a feline, or something like that. Well,
yeah.
Now imagine the frequency at which those occurred, and now translate it into about 10 of those per minute.
Yeah.
That we're experiencing.
Exactly.
And that is exactly what is happening. And by the way, we don't have a separate mechanism for those. Okay. There isn't an alternate operating system that processes, threat, hazard, or so-called salient information for our survival. The stock market, alarm bell that says it's going down goes through the same process as the tiger roar. Okay, so we don't have an alternative processing system, and hence you see the rising level of uncertainty, anxiety, because we're forced to constantly process all of this, and all of this compounded by the fact that is unquestionable. That all this information that now we're able to attain to basically to grasp and to find with our tools, it has multiplied the complexity of the world, and complexity is difficult to process. Also adds to uncertainty. And now that's where you see this counterintuitive trend where the world has been increasingly safer for us, but that's not at all how we feel.
That's right, exactly. And from what you know, what advice would you give to humans to be able to get through this, or to be able to withstand the acceleration of rate of information and rate of things that are trying to grab our attention? What are some tools, methods, techniques would you recommend?
Which is, I think, exactly, I believe that's the challenge of our decade, and if not longer, right? Because we're suffering physically the consequences of all of this, and it's just not rational. It's that we know there's something wrong with it, right? This is really the entire, if you will, thrust behind my effort of and naming this concept of safe esteem, right? It's a competency of becoming better at evaluating our health, safety, and security, and upgrade our operating system, if you will, from what served us well in the context of the bush in our evolutionary context, but it's really maladapted to the post-industrial era. And the first, and there's a series of, I guess, practices and heuristics that help us in that way. But the first is the most obvious and practical one, and is the courage to accept the fact that if information was a survival advantage for most of our species' history, it is no longer that way. You see, for as long as our information fit in a library, okay, or in a number of libraries around the world, and you could have a directory of the knowledge of the world. Basically, the more you consume, the better off you were. Okay, well, and then you could still make decisions whether that information was valuable or not. But we had the capacity to hold all that information. Now that we are in an information deluge, there is no limits to information. Information no longer has value per se. And we need to accept that we need to treat information the same way we treat food. We need to have a healthy diet. We need to learn that just because we crave the sugar, fat, salt, it's not really that good for us if we just keep consuming it.
Yep.
It's just not.
Yeah. The fast food is like the overstimulated kind of like micro content is, or like news that don't have any relevance to our daily life. They're kind of like those salty and sugary things that we should avoid, basically.
Yes. And by the way, what I was mentioning earlier about our natural instinct, to pay attention, right, to novel stimuli and everything that's a survival advantage. It's very similar to our natural and hardwired draw and pull to sugar and fat, right? It's hardwired.
Yes.
I don't know about you, but you can't walk by a burger joint without getting that. Right.
Yeah,
that
for sure.
burning fat that is like impossible to resist. So, and similarly, we have that draw to information. Okay, so we're easily manipulated by these tools that simply send us more information. The infinity scroll is probably, the equivalent of the slot machine and and whatever the soda dispenser. It's brutal for us. So we really have to exercise substantive amount of discipline to recognize that that's not good for us. Okay, and doesn't mean that you stop in total. It means that you have to have a diet.
Exactly.
Be smart. And now, so step number one is that. So what do? It's not that hard to turn off these notifications. It's not that hard to decide that when you're driving, that phone does not have to notify you of everything unless you can set that phone up. I have this phone set up in ways that if there's a real emergency, there's two people that can get through and my phone will ring. The rest of the time, it doesn't ring. Okay, I don't have notifications.
Yep.
I don't have, now, so the first piece is, again, creating an information diet. And there could be an entire conversation, of course, that is probably beyond the scope of this one, but what criteria do you use to select your sources of information, which is very tough too, right? Because we all believe that we're very good judges of what we should read, and we can find the truth, So, and that's another, somewhat common illusion, right? But so the first is simply it's a behavioral control, right? Piece. The other is this healthy skepticism with our own risk judgment and decision making. The most dangerous position that you can take vis-a-vis your own survival is to be really, really sure about how safe things are and about your understanding of the risk of an activity, of a location, or if you will, or maybe about the severity of a threat or a hazard. The smartest move that you can make in that direction is probably, something that was very well articulated in a book by Julia Galef. I think it's called The Soldier and the Scout. And the idea is a lot of people really tend to defend their risk judgment like soldiers. Like they feel like, I know what's best for me. I know how safe this city is. I've been here, and I know it. Okay, I've been here all my life.
Right.
It's a very dangerous position to be in. The ones who survive are the ones who have a scout mentality, that accept the fact that might be a little wrong, and they maintain the openness to discover more.
For sure.
Right.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Many call this metacognition, right? our ability to recognize that there's some patterns in our brains that basically are occurring without a lot of awareness of our own that may not be perfect.
Yeah, it's accurate. As accurate as we would like it to be. Yeah. Yeah.
We may be subject to some fallacies, some biases, and so maybe a little bit of skepticism and openness to recalibrate our judgment. Is there new information? Is there better information? So that's the second big step. Develop a healthy dose of the metacognition, self-awareness that maybe your risk judgment and your gut feelings are not necessarily always correct.
Yeah, right.
Remember, your gut feelings will still tell you when you get on a plane. It's like, right? It's 100 times safer than driving.
For sure.
But you don't get that gut feeling when you get in a car. So think about it that way, right? And finally, a third important one is explore this concept of uncertainty and how actually you might embrace it. And it's empowering to overcome some fears and actually understanding and discussing risks. People don't like to talk about death, about injury, about disease. It's kind of like a bit of a taboo subject, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I don't want to think about it. As if by thinking about it, you may, increase
the chances of it manifesting.
Yes, right. Yeah. But instead, a healthy relationship with uncertainty is actually an extraordinarily strong characteristics with very resilient people. The fact that that we can accept the fact that this is a very complicated, uncertain world. And somehow our job is to reduce that uncertainty, right? Try to, do I have 100% uncertainty? I don't know whether it's black or white or anything, or this is more dangerous than another one. Well, you know what? You can reduce that a little bit, make better decisions. Maybe it's not exactly 10 times, this place is, safer than that.
Yeah.
And you can make smarter decisions. It's not about eliminating risk. It's about being smarter. It's about reducing the flip of the coin approach to life, but instead accepting that life is exactly built, is uncertain, in almost every single aspect.
For sure.
Right? And great. How do I get better at dealing with uncertainty? It's actually empowering if you're better than others.
I agree. Yeah, man. Wow. This has been insightful, mind-opening. Thank you for sharing all of your thoughts and experiences around this ambiguous topic of risk. In closing, is there anything that maybe point people to a project that you're working on or any other resources that you would like to share in the short little message?
Sure. I'm aside from my commercial activities and my consulting work, I actually started a Substack called Safe Esteem. Pretty easy to find. Safe-Esteem. It's a play on word or self-esteem, and there's no commercial implication there. And but where I share some of these insights that ultimately are, if you will, my preliminary work towards a book that will ultimately bring all of this together to share these experiences and insights. So maybe that's a place to start.
Very nice. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Filippo, for being here again. Thank you, listeners, for sticking around all the way till the end. And I'll see you on the next one.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. Brilliant. Have a great day.
Awesome. Thanks.